This is Friday, the 10th of July already, and we've been at this for months and months. This is session number 25 of Old Testament Survey, and we're all the way out to the book of Judges. We're actually winding down this book of Judges. The first few judges are really pretty good guys, but as we get down toward the end of the sequence, they are less and less effective and less godly men. There is, very importantly, a downward trajectory in the book of Judges. Uh, the ancient rabbis, back around the time of Christ, who obviously didn't know much better than we do, uh, believed that this book was written by Samuel. Samuel very famously warned the people of Israel that it would be a bad idea to have a king. The people said, "Give us a king like all of the other nations." And Samuel said, "You really don't want a standard king, because the king will fail you. The king will do things to you and with you that you would prefer not to have happen." Uh, and he talked about taxes and the draft and the various projects and the debt and all of the rest that goes along with a big human government. And Samuel says this is a very bad idea. The book of Judges is built around the theme of the failure of human leaders. Uh, One of the most important points in Judges is that without the people walking with God, no amount of good, mediocre, or awful human leadership will solve the problems. There is only one king who can solve the problem. So I believe that the book of Judges looks forward to the coming of Messiah and the Messianic kingdom. There is, in fact, a king who can solve the world's problems, but only if we acknowledge him and follow him. So that I take to be the underlying point of the book of Judges. And for that reason, I tend to agree with the old rabbis in the Talmud that Judges was written by Samuel. Now, of course, the book is anonymous. We don't know. But I think that's a pretty good guess. It's at least as good as any other. Okay, as we get into chapter 10 and 11, we're going to come up with Jephthah. And Jephthah is followed by Samson. And I need to draw you a quick map. Let me see if I can draw a map here. And this will be on the whiteboard. Okay, I should be sharing, and there it is. Okay, very good. And I've got a thing here that I don't want to be. I love it when that happens. Okay, let's do this in blue, just for the fun of it. There's the Sea of Galilee, and here's the Dead Sea. This takes up most of Israel. There's Jerusalem will be just about there, which is in the hand of Canaanites at the moment. But there's Jerusalem. And it gives us an idea where everything is. The two major influences at the time of Jephthah and Samson were the Philistines and the Ammonites. The Philistines had this stretch of country here, what today is called the Gaza Strip and the area north. So Philistines are in this direction, and we see Philistines pointing eastward into the Central Hill Country, primarily up the major valleys, the valley of Ajalon, the valley of Sorek, and the valley of Elah. And those are going to be important later on, but they come up three valleys. On the other side of the Jordan River, we find another group, the Ammonites, sons of Ammon. And you'll remember the Ammonites go all the way back to Lot. So the daughters of Lot had Ammon and Moab, the two sons. The Ammonites ended up being a more urban, more powerful enemy. And during the time of Jephthah and afterwards, we see pressure from the Ammonites against this this Jordan Valley region. And Jephthah's problem is going to be there. So as we get into chapter 10 and 11, we're going to see Jephthah, who is a Gileadite, interacting with Ammonites, and there's quite a war that goes on there. But the Ammonites are not going to be defeated. They're pushed back. There's a time of uneasy truce. Samson, on the other hand, lives in the valley of the Sorek, and his job is to make war on the Philistines. Those are our two big stories. Now, neither Jephthah nor Samson will finally win the war against either Ammonites or Philistines, and we're going to discover as this story continues that the Philistines eventually will become a major problem in the Central Hill Country, and that the Ammonites will become a major pincers movement from the Transjordan area. And these two powers will not finally be pacified until the time of David. Saul fought against both Philistines and Ammonites. It was David who finally won those wars. This is another 100 years after the time that we're recording here in Judges. Okay, enough of that. Let's see if I can end this. Oops. Okay, we'll end the sharing, and I will share something else. Let's see if I can do that. We'll get into chapter 10 of the book of Judges. And here it is. Let's see if I can make it work. Slideshow, presenter view, bingo. Okay. Now I've got the presenter view up. This is the photograph that you see there in the background. Not a great photograph. I took that with film and scanned it. Scanning slides is not nearly as good as shooting them originally in digital, but this one is a scanned slide. This shot is on the Jordanian side of the border, on the road up to Amman. So this is very close to the area, very similar terrain to the area where Jephthah lived and where he did his thing. In chapter 10, we see that the people of Israel again did the evil thing in the sight of the Lord. That evil thing is going to be the worship of Baal in the variety of ways that they do that. It's not a good thing. The repentance that they appear um, to exercise once the Ammonites begin to oppress them was not sincere. And so God paid no real attention. Uh, and after a while, the people of Israel cried out again, and the Ammonites were called to arms. At the end of the chapter, we see that they camped in Gilead, and the people of Israel came together at Mizpah, and the people and the leaders of Gilead said to one another, "Who is the man who will begin to fight against the Ammonites? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Well, there wasn't a leader. They had not prepared for battle, which is a terrible mistake. The threat of the Ammonites had been coming for quite some time, and any wise leader, any mighty man of valor who happened to live in the area would have seen this coming and would have suggested that it was time to prepare, but they were unprepared. They weren't ready for a war. And it seemed to them like a really bad time. So they didn't have a leader, and that's when Jephthah is introduced. Now, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior, but he was the son of a prostitute. Gilead was the father of Jephthah. No, that's a little bit enigmatic because the name of the region is Gilead, but we're also told that Gilead is the father of Jephthah. So perhaps there's a man named Gilead who lived in Gilead, or perhaps all of the men of Gilead who had played with the prostitutes were, for all practical purposes, Jephthah's father. We don't know quite how to understand that, but the upshot is the bottom line is that Jephthah was not considered an honorable man. He was the son of a prostitute, and no one knew who his father was. It was just it was an ugly situation. It wasn't acceptable, even though, and I think this is the irony of the picture. The men of Gilead routinely went with Canaanite prostitutes. So this is a very it's an ugly time in Israel's history, and Gilead's wife also bore him sons. So that makes us think maybe there's a specific man here. And when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out. They said, "You shall not have an inheritance. You are the son of another woman." Jephthah fled, lived in the land of Tob, which means badlands, and worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. Now, this foreshadows another exile that we're going to meet in just another couple of books. When we get over into First Samuel, we'll find that David was a mighty man. And he too was exiled from Saul's court, and his brothers wanted nothing to do with him. And once he was exiled, he gathered around him worthless fellows, people who were in trouble, and he made of them mighty men. 600 mighty men who would later go on to establish the kingdom of Israel. So Jephthah and David can be contrasted here. I find the whole Jephthah story fascinating, uh, not just for the story itself, but in this contrast with David. Jephthah is a really, really mediocre character. So Jephthah fled, and at that time, after a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. The Ammonites made war, and the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob, and they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our leader." And Jephthah said, "Will I really uh, be your leader?" And they promised if he won this battle, he would be the leader of the whole nation. So Jephthah, verse 12, sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites. Now, this is a diplomatic move, which is actually the first bit of wisdom that we've seen on Jephthah's part. And we see this and we think, wow, he may actually have some potential. All military professionals will tell you that diplomacy is a good thing. Uh, Lying to each other from other sides of the table, all the things that diplomats do, is better than going to war. Going to war is a bad thing. It's a last resort. Nobody wants to go to war, especially in the ancient world. Going to war meant that hundreds, maybe thousands of young men were going to kill each other in the most brutal sort of ways. They would be cutting off arms and legs and hacking at each other's heads with axes and swords and whatnot. It was a terrible thing, a genuinely terrible thing. Modern war is every bit as bad, but somehow it's more antiseptic because we can do it at a distance. Ancient warfare was up close and personal and horrific on every level. And Jephthah knew that, which is to his credit. I have to say that Jephthah has got something right. And he sent a diplomatic mission to the Ammonites and said, what do you have against me that you've come to fight? And the king of the Ammonites answered the messengers of Jephthah, because Israel, on coming up from Egypt, took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and to the Jordan. Now therefore restore it peaceably. And Jephthah again sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites. Now the contention is over land, specifically this land in the photograph. This is land between the Arnon and the Jabbok and between the Jordan and the river. And as you can see, this is nice land. This is a good fertile farmland. And as you go higher up in elevation, it turns into very nice green pasture land. It's actually very pretty country. It reminds me of some parts of Italy or some parts here in our own country. Kind of it's not so tropical, not so hot. It's really a very nice place. Uh, so it's not surprising that this is what the Ammonites would like. So Jephthah answers back. Thus says Jephthah, verse 14. Israel did not take away the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. The Ammonites and the Moabites, we should remember, were considered relatives. The Amalekites were not considered relatives, and so they could be slaughtered at will. Same with the Canaanites. But the Ammonites and the Moabites had to be treated with some level of respect. So the Moabites were not simply slaughtered; they were bypassed. Even when Balak, son of Beor, sent for Balaam, which was an act of war. The same is true of the Ammonites. And Jephthah says Israel didn't take away the land of Moab or the Ammonites, but when they came up from Egypt, Israel went through the wilderness of the Red Sea, came to Kadesh, and then sent messengers to Edom, saying, "Let us pass through your land." But he wouldn't listen. So they sent also to the king of Moab, but he would not consent. So Israel remained at Kadesh. Then they journeyed through the wilderness along the king's highway. And went around the land of Edom and the land of Moab and arrived on the east side of the land of Moab, camped on the other side of the Arnon. Now, you'll notice a whole lot of very specific historical detail. This is often important in a diplomatic conversation. We're establishing the historical context of the situation that we now face. And this all bears the tag of authenticity. Sounds like the way it would really go down. Israel sent messengers to Edom, and they wouldn't let us go. So they journeyed through the wilderness, came up on the east side of the land. They didn't enter the territory of Moab. The Arnon was the boundary. Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, king at Heshbon, and he wouldn't let them through. So uh, Sihon gathered his people together for war and was defeated, and the city of Heshbon was taken. The Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his people into the hand of Israel. They defeated them, so Israel took possession of the land of the Amorites who inhabited that country. So Sihon is an Amorite, not an Ammonite, but an Amorite. He's a Canaanite king, and therefore taking his land was perfectly acceptable. God commanded that the Canaanites be driven out, not Ammonites or Moabites. And Jephthah is simply recounting all of this to demonstrate that what the people of Israel have done is perfectly legitimate. This is exactly what they were supposed to have done. And the Lord, the God of Israel, uh, gave this to us. We took all the territory from the Arnon to the Jabbok, from the wilderness to the Jordan. The Lord dispossessed the Amorites from before his people. And are you to take possession of this land now? In other words, God gave us this land in the form of a great battle against the Amorites, who were your enemies as well. Now we have taken this land. Uh, why don't you possess the land that your God Chemosh gives you to possess? So that again is a somewhat ironic line. Their god Chemosh is actually the god of the underworld. We know him by a number of different names. He's a god who accepts the human sacrifice of infants. Chemosh is a really ugly, terrible god. And that's the god, one of the chief gods of the Ammonites. And so the message is, our God gave us this beautiful land that had belonged to the Amorites. Surely you have a God as well, and surely he has given you what you are supposed to have. Enjoy this land of yours. And obviously, that's sarcastic. The land of the Ammonites it begins at the edge of the desert. We run from the edge of the desert, and right at that point, we'll find Amman, Jordan. A visit to Amman, Jordan is interesting. It is not a very pretty city. The Romans had a city there. There was a Greco-Roman town that was part of the Decapolis at Amman, and there's older layers. They go all the way back to the late Bronze Age, all the way back to the time of Joshua. There's a temple that belongs to the Ammonites near the airport for Amman, Jordan, which is well and thoroughly out in the desert. The King's Highway passes directly through Amman, Jordan. So that's the boundary, the edge of the desert. That's where the Ammonites had inherited their land. So God promised Israel this beautiful place. And oh, by the way, you Ammonites are just going to have to make do with whatever your God Chemosh can come up with. Chemosh could come up with a little sliver of desert. Pretty nasty background. It's interesting the way it works. Okay, now what's important about all of this? Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever contend against Israel or go to war with them? While Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages that are on the bank of the Arnon for 300 years, why did you not deliver them within that time? I haven't sinned against you. The Lord our God gave us this land 300 years ago. We've been here all this time, and you've never said a word. Now, what is it now that brings this to a head and you feel like you have the right to come and take the land? That makes it for I think, a fascinating uh, interplay. I think the diplomacy is fascinating there. Uh, Biblical scholars have focused on the 300 years. And think about this. We've got two numbers that help us to see the date of the Exodus. The first one we're going to be looking at later in 2 Kings 6. Well, 1 Kings 6, where Solomon dedicates the temple. That takes place in 1066 or 966 BC. The Exodus is said to have taken place 480 years before the dedication of the temple. 480 years, that's 1446. You subtract 40 years for the wilderness wanderings, that's 1406 or so, 1400 or so BC. Jephthah comes at about 1100 BC. We know he comes before Samuel, significantly before Samuel. They don't overlap. And Samuel comes before Saul and David. David's date of 1010 BC is one of the clearer Old Testament dates. So Jephthah has to be around 1100 BC, plus or minus a little bit, but close enough. So Jephthah's estimate of the amount of time, tracing backwards from 1100 BC, comes out to 1400 BC, which is the time of the conquest, according to the Bible. If a late date for the Exodus, a 1250 BC date for the Exodus, for example, is taken, that would make a conquest of around 1200 BC, and it would make 300 years nonsense. Now, the scholars who argue for the late date have to argue that Jephthah's number and Solomon's numbers are both nonsense. Neither one of them can make any sense at all. They have to be completely made up and completely irrational numbers in order for the late date to work. And most of those who accept a late date for the Exodus don't believe that the Bible is authoritative historically. Some of them believe that the Bible is true in matters of faith, but not in matters of history or science or all of the rest. I'm one of those people who believe that the Bible is true. It is the Word of God. It is accurate. And when we start with that expectation, we discover that everything fits together nicely. Well, that gets us into this really awful story that continues from here. Beginning at verse 29, the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. Now we see this term, the Spirit came upon someone, fairly regularly in the Judges period. We're going to see this a bit more in the Samson narrative. where the Spirit of God came upon him, or the Spirit of God came upon him with power, and he went off to do some spectacular thing. This gives us some clues as to the nature of the filling of the Holy Spirit in the Old Testament. The filling of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament is really not extraordinary. It's the routine indwelling work of the Holy Spirit. As believers walk with God, the Spirit of God permeates every part of them and does his work in their lives. In the Old Testament, the Holy Spirit didn't live in believers. He would occasionally come upon believers for empowerment. Now, I do believe that uh, actual believers, that is, godly men like David or Moses, uh, had the Holy Spirit nearby most of the time. But the big difference between Old Testament believers and New Testament believers is the indwelling spirit. And when the Spirit of God comes upon Jephthah with power, uh, he had been elsewhere at a distance before, and now comes upon him with great power. And Jephthah called throughout Gilead, Manasseh, and he made a vow to the Lord as his army was gathering. This is verse 30, 11:30. If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's. Or, I think it should be an or rather than an and here, I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Some of our translations say, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. It's the same word as both and or. So we've got to make a choice here. Uh, and as we see later on, this is rather a heavy choice. The vow is a bit obscure. Nevertheless, Jephthah went off to battle, and the battle here is anticlimactic. He wins the battle against the Ammonites. The Ammonites go home. They're not a problem for another few years. They will come back. Afterwards, Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and dances. Okay, nice girl. Now here she is, his only child, with neither son nor daughter otherwise. We're not told about Jephthah's wife. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you've brought me low. Because I've opened my mouth to the Lord, I can't take back my vow." Now, this was not a good vow to make. God had already come upon him with power and promised victory. He didn't need to take this vow. And it was an unwise vow on top of that. He's promised to give whatever comes out the door to the Lord, whatever that means. So let's look at what happens next. And she said, "My father, you've opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth. Now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, the Ammonites." And so she said to her father, "Let this thing be done. Leave me alone for 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions." So Jephthah's daughter and her friends or girlfriends went out into the hills, these very hills, and wept for her virginity. And afterwards, she came back to her father, and Jephthah did with her according to his vow. Now, what did he do? The traditional take here in the commentaries is that he offered her up as a burnt offering. And that would have been, of course, in contradiction to Old Testament law. But it's a possibility. The judges period is so brutal, so far from God, so awful, and the Jephthah story is so far toward the back end of the judge's narrative that, frankly, I have to admit this is a possibility. There is, however, another option that I think is at least possible, and that is that Jephthah offered her as a lifetime servant to the tabernacle. This would fit either give to the Lord for service forever, or offer as a burnt offering. If a sheep or a goat or a bull or something had come out first, which I think would be unlikely, he could have sacrificed it. So that's a possibility. I think it's one way of handling it. Any way we look at it, Jephthah's story is not a happy one. Chapter 12 takes us into, a little farther into chapter 12, takes us into conflict with Ephraim, between Gilead and Ephraim, and there was a civil war here. Ephraim was always a pain in the neck. They wanted to get in on every battle, and they couldn't. They're fighting back and forth. This is where the word shibboleth is introduced. The end of chapter 12, we see three relatively peaceful judgeships concerning whom we have no knowledge. Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon are otherwise completely unknown. In chapters 13 through 16, we have the story of Samson. This photograph is taken of the Sorek Valley. Sorek Valley is the traditional route up to Jerusalem. It dead ends in a box canyon. Sorek Valley was the location of Dan's inheritance. And the big problem for the Danites here in the Sorek Valley was that they couldn't push the Philistines out. The Philistines were, by this time, by around 1100 BC or so, the Philistines were an invading people. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. And there's a variety of different migratory groups who seem to have come through this area over a period of centuries. Among them are the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are farther north, and they are interrelated with Canaanites. The Philistines seem to be interrelated with Amorites. They're very, very warlike, a very sophisticated people group. The cities that we have of the Philistines, for instance, Ashkelon, has been very well studied. Is a very well built city. It's got palaces, it's got temples, it's got a city wall, it's got all of the usual things, and it's a very advanced place. We know the Philistines were not cavemen. They were not brutes. They were actually quite advanced. And so we see this story of Samson and the Philistines. So now I'm going to introduce you to the story that's going to end up with the jawbone of a donkey. This thing is not a very good picture, but that is the jawbone of a donkey that has been remodeled to turn it into a sickle. The sharp edge there on the inside is made of small bits of flint that are made into a blade. The jawbone of a donkey would, in fact, make quite a tool. So Samson is born in chapter 13. There was a certain man of Zorah by the name of Manoah. His wife was barren. Very common theme in the Old Testament, the barren woman. She prayed, God sent her the possibility of conception, so she conceives and bears a child. They're going to name him Samson, but the angel says to the woman, uh, you're going to bear a child, but he's going to be a Nazarite from birth. Now, the Nazarite vow we were introduced to back in the book of Numbers. Nazarite vow is usually an exceptional vow where we're going to uh, we're going to set ourselves apart to God for a period of time, 40 days, 3 months, whatever the length of time might be, during which time no wine, we won't cut our hair, and some other little bits. It's not a vow to avoid sin. It's a vow to be different, to set ourselves apart for God for a period of prayer, usually, or for some project for God. Samson was going to be in a project for God during his whole life. And Manoah prayed, and he ended up speaking with the angel of the Lord as well. Uh, and Samson was born. Chapter 14 takes us up into Samson's marriage. Samson was only married once, but he had relationships with all kinds of women. Samson was a womanizer. His exploits would make Hollywood blush. Well, I suppose that's not even possible anymore. But the stuff that Samson does, he's not a good role model for anybody. As I say, the judges is just going down and down and down. It's a death spiral for the nation of Israel. So Samson went down to Timnah. Now, Samson's home was in the Sorek Valley. Traditionally, it's at a place called Shimshon, Shimshon Junction. There's a tell on the spot, and that this shot is taken from the top of Samson's tell across the Sorek Valley, looking toward Zorah and Eshtaol that are also there. The place that we call Timnah is off to the left in this photograph, about a kilometer. I mean, really not very far. You could, if you were really good with a sling, you could throw a rock and hit Timnah. It's that close. Timnah was on the Philistine side of the border. So back to Samson. So Samson was down at Timnah. He had gone to visit the Philistines of all people, and he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. He came and told his father and mother, behold, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Get her for me as a wife. Now his father and mother said, can't you find a relative, someone among the people of Israel? And Samson said, no, that's the one I want. Get her for me. So his father and mother didn't know that it was from the Lord. Here's the foreshadowing. This is going to come in verse 4. Verse 5. So Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him, roaring. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him with power. And although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. Now, I've been around young goats, and I can't imagine tearing a young goat into pieces. But Samson took the lion and tore it apart. It is quite a feat of strength. Samson is going to have this remarkable strength all during his career up until the very end. This is the outworking power of the Spirit of God. Now, this is an unusual thing. Most Old Testament characters don't have Samson's strength. This is a very unusual thing. And some days later, he returned to take the woman, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. And he scraped it into his hands and went on, eating the honey as he went. And his father had come down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast, for so the young men used to do. And so we've got the wedding feast, and Samson is given 30 companions, and he says to them, uh, I'll get each of you a suit of clothes if you can tell me my riddle, if you can explain my riddle. And the riddle is, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. For 3 days, they couldn't figure out what that was about. On the fourth, they said to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, or we will burn you in your father's house with fire. So this is nice people that Samson is with. When Samson went back the next time, the men of the city said to him, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? So they had figured out the riddle. Samson said to the men, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. He's accusing his own wife of infidelity here. Uh, and of course, she had told the secret. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men. Ashkelon is a Philistine city, and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. And so the wife is given off to the best man. Well, Samson was angry. He came back to get his wife, and she had been given away. So in chapter 15, we're told the story of taking 300 foxes, tying their tails together, attaching a torch between each pair of foxes, and turning them loose in the standing grain, which is a terrible thing. It would have burned many, many thousands of acres. It's an absolutely awful thing to do. Well, the Philistines came after him, and this takes us up to the story of Samson killing 1,000 men with the fresh jawbone of a donkey. He would have to have killed the donkey in order to get the fresh jawbone, but still a remarkable tale of strength and endurance. As soon as he'd finished, he'd throw away the jawbone. And what a story. It even includes the men of Judah giving him up, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. It's an ugly story. So Samson went up to Gaza. This is chapter 16. And there he saw a prostitute. And of course, he never saw a prostitute he didn't like, so he went into her. And the Gazites were told, Samson has come. They surrounded the place and set an ambush at the gate of the city, and they kept quiet. And Samson lay still until midnight. At midnight, he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts. This would be a very, very heavy thing. This would be an incredible weight for one man to pick up. He pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of a hill that is near Hebron. Such a useless feat of strength, as a demonstration that he was a big, powerful brute of a man. And then we see the story of Delilah, Samson and Delilah. What a guy. So he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said, seduce him, see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him. So Delilah seduces Samson. And having seduced him, every night she nags him for the secret to his strength. 4 times Samson tells her what his strength is. The first 3 were obvious lies. He said, if you bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, if you bind me with new ropes. Each time Samson awoke, behold, the Philistines are upon you. He broke the bonds and began slaying Philistines left and right. Uh, and finally, these seven, well, not quite finally, thirdly, 7 locks of my head into the web of the womb or of the loom. And he pulled the whole thing up and began killing Philistines. Finally, she says, "You don't love me. You really don't love me at all. If you love me, you'd tell me the secret." And Samson must have known he was being played, but his arrogance overpowered him. And he said, "Well, if you cut my hair, that'll do the job." Samson's strength was not in his hair. This is a mistake. When we tell the story to children, we do the flannel graph with Samson getting a haircut, as though that was the secret to his strength. The hair was not the secret to the strength. The ritual of the Nazirite vow was not the secret to Samson's strength. The secret to Samson's strength was the presence of the Spirit of God in his life. Samson simply didn't know that the Spirit of God had left him. He had so little experience with God that he didn't notice when the fellowship was broken. Samson was that kind of well, you forgive me, Samson was a jerk. He took the Spirit of God for granted and didn't recognize when he was gone. So the Philistines grabbed him, they put out his eyes, they put him in prison. Later on, Samson died in a Philistine temple. Samson was brought out to entertain the troops and was tied between 2 pillars of the temple. When he had his opportunity, he began pushing on the pillars, and we're told that the number of those killed in the collapse of the temple was greater than all that he'd killed the rest of his life. Samson is a disgusting character, but frankly, we're not through yet. The story of the judges gets worse. So we've got another couple of stories. 17 through 21 is what we call an epilogue. It starts out with Dan's idolatry and migration north. The photograph in the background that you can't really see is way in the north. That's Tel Dan on the north end of modern Israel. That was not a part of the promised land. The people who lived in Dan, which was called Laish in those days, were peaceful people and should not have been done away with. At any rate, this story is going to take place in Oops, I don't want to get into that one quite yet. Dan's migration, 17 and 18, starts out with a story of Micah, the hill country of Ephraim. And he said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke in my ears, behold, the silver is with me, I took it. And his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord. And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver. And his mother said, I dedicate the silver to the Lord, so let's make an idol from this. This is all completely wrong. You shall not steal. You shall not make graven images. These people don't know anything, and it's rather sad. And so the idol is dedicated to the Lord with these 200 pieces of money. Soon there was a young man from Bethlehem who was a Levite, and he came through town. He had nothing better to do, and so he got a job serving in Micah's house as a priest. And Micah said to him, be to me a father and priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver. And there he was. And later on, the Danites, chapter 18, we're told in those days there was no king in Israel. And the people of Dan are seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance had fallen to them. Well, it had actually, but they hadn't been able to keep it or to make anything proper of their inheritance. So 5 men were sent to spy out the land, and they came past Micah's house and noticed the idol and the priest and a bunch of other stuff. So a bunch of the men of Dan, on their way north, stopped at Micah's house, threatened Micah, stole the idol and other property, and ran off with the priest. The whole tribe of Dan then headed far to the north, where they attacked and destroyed the city of Laish, which they renamed Dan. Now, frankly, this is about the last we will ever hear of the tribe of Dan. Their idolatry and their migration north is a generally bad thing. This is not a pretty story. This shows the prevalence of idolatry in the community, even among the Levites. It shows that Dan's migration was wrong. It was the result of a lack of faith. When we get into chapter 19, we see another story. This is even uglier. This involves another Levite from Ephraim, north of Jerusalem, who came down to Bethlehem. Now, this photograph in the background is a shepherd outside of Bethlehem. That's Bethlehem in the distance, and way in the distance you can see Jerusalem. That's what makes this kind of a nice angle to shoot from. The fields there are the so-called shepherds' fields, where the shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks by night for Christmas. And no, we don't know that that's exactly where it was, but this is, in fact, a pasture, and those are, in fact, sheep. And that is really Bethlehem. Anyway, Bethlehem is where this is all going to happen. So a Levite comes from Ephraim and grabs himself a concubine in Bethlehem. Now, a concubine is not a slave, but quite a bit less than a wife. It's an unmarried live-in girlfriend. So this is not a good relationship. This is not a marriage relationship. This is not a healthy relationship. The Levite should have known better, but apparently he didn't. And one day he and the concubine came back to Bethlehem to visit the in-laws, to visit Dad, and he came back. This woman had been unfaithful for a while, but anyway, he came back to see Dad, and they visited for a bit, and he wanted to go. The Levite wanted to leave. The man insisted he stay. He stayed until too late at night, and finally headed back. Came through Jerusalem, got to the north side of Jerusalem, all the way to a place called Gibeah. And the Levite was invited into the house of a man. The concubine, of course, was required to sleep outside. The men of the city, in a scene very similar to the scene of Lot and Sodom, insisted on bringing out the newcomer so that they could have sex with him. The homeowner said, no, don't do that. Instead, take this concubine, do with her whatever you will. And so the men of the city, who apparently were able to swing both directions, took their pleasure with the concubine all night. And when they were finished, they left her in the city square. She wandered back to the place where the Levite had stayed. And when he got up in the morning, he found her there on the front porch of this house, dead, of course. He gives her a good kick to make sure. And then once he was sure she was dead, he cut her into 12 pieces and sent chunks of this poor girl to all of the corners of Israel with a note saying, such a thing should not be done in Israel. The men of Israel, all of the tribes of Israel, responded with a civil war, which ended up killing huge numbers of the tribe of Benjamin. This is not a good thing. It's actually a really, really bad thing. There is demand for justice. Revenge happens. At this point, Jabesh Gilead is a part of the Ammonites. And after the war with Benjamin, we're told in chapter 21 that the men of Israel are feeling bad that the men of Benjamin don't have wives, and there's no way to put everything back together. Nobody's going to give an Israelite girl to the men of Benjamin. So there's a rebuilding of Benjamin that takes place by stealing a bunch of women from the Amorites in Jabesh Gilead. It's an ugly story. So what is the significance of this story? It's a really, really icky story. It pictures the deep immorality of the period. It also highlights two cities that are going to be related to David and Saul. Gibeah of Saul and Jabesh Gilead, which is going to be an important focus of warfare during the time of Saul and then of David. So the era is dated and characterized at the end of the book. 2028 is significant. Let's see if I can find that. Well, no. Wives provided for the 10 tribes. The era is characterized. At this time, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. That's the way it was. The little book of Ruth, on the other hand, is like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the Judges period. I don't. I hate to go too fast through the book of Ruth, but I'm going to because we need to get rolling. But take time to read the story of Ruth. It's a great story. Ruth is a wonderful little story. The author of the book of Ruth is anonymous. Some attribute it to Samuel, and I think that would actually fit fairly well. But most conservative scholars believe it was written during the era of David. That's about the right time. The book is named after the principal character, who is a Moabite woman who married an Israelite and later migrated to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. And this photograph is Bethlehem from one of the bits of high ground to the north. It's actually a kibbutz to the north of Bethlehem, where we stayed once. This is another shot of Bethlehem. That's Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem. Ramat Rachel is the name of that place. And there you see the apartment buildings in Bethlehem proper. Ruth really is like a breath of fresh air. The most important thing to recognize is that Ruth happens in the time of the judges. The first line says it this way. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges were judging. Okay, so here's the judges period. We're not told exactly what time. It doesn't really matter. But it's an important reminder that in the midst of spiritual apostasy and political anarchy, Ruth is an example of the continued existence of the godly. There are godly people, and there are normal people who are not ungodly, anarchic, Antifa terrorist types. There are good people, and probably the majority of Israel uh, wanted to be good and would have preferred to live in a godly society. And the little book of Ruth shows that this was still normal. A key element of the story is a thing called levirate marriage. Levirate marriage is the practice of a close relative, a male relative, marrying the widow of a deceased Israelite. So if a man would die, his brother or an uncle or some other near relative would marry the woman, and the first child of that marriage would be the inheritor of the dead man's possessions, his land. Then the second in line, the second son, would be the inheritor of the redeemer, of the man who had married the widow. So we end up keeping two lines of inheritance intact. It's actually not a bad idea if we're going to be passing down land through families, and that's what this is all about. Uh, Now, interestingly, Ruth turns out to be the great great grandmother of David. So she would have to have lived sometime in the 12th century, maybe a contemporary of Gideon. It's hard to know. At any rate, the picture in this book is of uh, a kinsman redeemer who marries Ruth. The kinsman is Boaz, a man of Judah, a man of Bethlehem. And this is one of the few accounts in the Bible of this practice of levirate marriage. There's a strong element of grace in this picture. Boaz didn't have to do this thing. There were other close relatives, and Boaz chose to do this thing as an act of grace. He's a more distant relative. He carries out his responsibility in love. So it's a love story. It's lots of fun. Okay, here's how the book lays out the key ideas. Uh, the theology of Ruth. Lots to do with God. God is the sovereign. He is the Lord of Israel. He will always carry out His plans for His people. God is at work in Israel, even in the most awful times. Secondly, the concept of redemption, the term redeem, has its roots in a word that means to buy someone out of slavery. If a person has been sold into slavery, the purchase price can be paid. The person can be purchased out of slavery. The same term is used of a practice of levirate marriage. It involved the purchase of the land, and with the land goes the wife. They're both used together. The terms redeem and kinsman redeemer and redemption are used some 20 times in this little book. Then finally, God's love is illustrated in this book. Boaz's love for Ruth is like God's love for his people. The picture of God's relationship to his people, like a man to his wife, is a beautiful thing. The term used for God's love and for Boaz's love for Ruth in this book is the Hebrew word chesed, H-E-S-E-D, chesed. Chesed is the most important Old Testament word for the love of God. It's a considerably more powerful word than the synonym ahav. And I'm not going to tell you that one, you don't need it, but chesed is a very, very important word, and it's a word of salvation. As we walk through the book is introduced. We've got Naomi and Elimelech. uh, a couple from Bethlehem who had two sons whose names were Machlon and Kilion. And those words mean weak and sickly, respectively. So they were probably not in great shape. There was a famine in the land. They were from Bethlehem. The term Bethlehem, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And there was no bread in the house of bread. So off they went. They took off and went to Moab. And while they were there, Elimelech died, and she was left with two sons who took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there 10 years. And then Machlon and Kilion died. And so the woman was left without her two sons. So that takes us into the story, beginning at verse 6. Orpah and Ruth, Naomi encourages to go home. Go back to your parents. I'm not going to have any more children. This is all over. Orpah cries, hugs her mother-in-law, and goes home. Ruth, on the other hand, insists on staying with Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. Famous story, very a great story of loyalty. And so Ruth returns with Naomi to Bethlehem. In Bethlehem, uh, Naomi tells Ruth, there's nothing we can do. We have no land. We have no income. You're going to have to go gleaning. Now, gleaning was something that poor people could do in the fields of local farmers. Grain would be left around the edges. And so we see the career of Ruth as a gleaner. And as it happens, strangely enough, as luck would have it, the owner of the land where Ruth began gleaning was a man named Boaz, who was a good man. He's a godly man, and he happens to be a relative. Naomi figures this out real quick. And says you should go back there and make sure you look nice while you're doing this. Uh, Boaz noticed that here's a girl who works hard, and she's Naomi's daughter-in-law. He sees to it that Ruth has plenty of grain, and at this time, Naomi says we need to do something about this. So in chapter 3, we have the famous story. The threshing season is up, and the men stay at the threshing floor at night. And Naomi instructs Ruth, go to the threshing floor and meet this man. See what he will do. Declare yourself as his kinsman, as his relative, and let's see what he will do. So the story of Ruth coming to the threshing floor and curling up around the feet of Boaz. So she uncovered his feet, the Bible says. It doesn't need to mean anything more than that. She uncovered his feet and kind of curled up around his feet, which is just touching. And Boaz apparently noticed during the night that there was somebody there, so he looked up, and there was Ruth, and she looks up, kind of waves, "Hi there, it's me, Ruth. You remember me?" Boaz, of course, remembers Ruth and recognizes immediately the danger. But here's a woman on the threshing floor. This could mean immorality. This is not a good thing. But Boaz also realizes that Ruth is offering the opportunity of a redemption. She's offering marriage. This confrontation can mean nothing else. He says, "What, what a great thing that you've done for me, daughter." Boaz is undoubtedly an older man. For instead of running after the younger men, you've made this offer. So tomorrow, let's meet in the gate and we will see what happens. And in chapter 4, we see the redemption. Boaz went to the city gate and he sat down there, and behold, there is a closer relative, a redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken, and he came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, my friend, sit down." And he got some of the elders of the city there in the gate, and he said, "Sit down." As they sat down, he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling a parcel of land. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the others of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." So we've got a boy gets girl, boy loses girl story going on here. And Boaz was willing to give the other man the first choice. Uh, and he says, "Well, sure, that sounds really good. I'll redeem that." And Boaz says, "Oh, by the way," this is verse 5. I almost forgot. There's just this one more thing that I need to tell you. In the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in his inheritance. Ah, there's a wife that goes with this land. And that made the Redeemer balk. It made him stop. For he says, that would endanger my own inheritance. What this means is that this man was already married and he couldn't take two wives because that would mess up the line of inheritance. It would somehow or another legally, that would be a bad thing to do. The fact that there are people who not only know the law in Israel but are willing to follow it should be an encouraging word. There is at least a powerful minority in Israel. They could not govern the land, they couldn't break the anarchy, but there were good people, and this man was one of them. So Boaz said, "Okay, I'll do that." Now, the custom in former times concerning redeeming and exchanging, Boaz took off his sandal and gave it to the other man. And he said, "No, on all this day, everyone who is witness here, that I have bought the land from the hand of Naomi, all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Kilion and Machlon, and Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon, I have bought to be my wife." That's kind of a formal and strange way of saying it, but this is what happens. So, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth; she became his wife, and he went in to her. And the Lord gave her conception; she bore a son, and Naomi was able to nurse this child. What a beautiful picture. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Here's a little fragment of genealogy. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. You remember Salmon, who married Rahab? Rahab fathered Boaz. Notice the relationship there. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. So here we have this beautiful genealogical snippet that tells us that both Rahab and Ruth are in the lineage of Christ. This beautiful little story of godly people doing the right thing in the right way in a time of terrible ungodliness, the worst portion of Israel's history, and here in the middle of it, doing the right thing. Rahab, the prostitute, who became a part of the people of Israel contrary to the law. Ruth, the Moabitess, who should never have been allowed into the assembly of Israel, yet became the wife of Boaz. These exceptions to the law are acts of God's grace. God makes room. He made room for us. And that act of grace leads up to the birth of the Messiah. The messianic line continues through this line. And we're going to continue to see that the goodness of the Messiah, the godliness of Christ, does not depend on an unbroken line of plaster saints. The people of Israel at that time were not all good people. There was goodness here, but they were not all good. There's a great deal of sin. And in response to the sin of his people, God responds with grace. There ought to be, for us, in a difficult world, a bit of encouragement in the story of Ruth. Even in the worst of times, there are godly men and women who uphold and who carry on the traditions of God's word. And I hope that that's us. That's what I hope for all of us. Well, I'm going to unmute here. We're going to see one another again on Monday. We'll begin with the books of the Samuels on Monday. Let me get the gallery view here so I can see everybody again. Okay, hey, there's Joel. How are you? And I see Dawn. And I know I saw a moment ago, I saw Oscar. Okay, there's James. Okay, see you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. Happy
Okay.
weekend.
All right. Hey, there's Oscar and Sally. I hear Donna in the background hollering, "Here we come." So we're going to see Deborah before it's done. Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
On
Jan.
one side, and here comes Deborah. There, Deborah. Wave. Wave at everybody.
Hey, Deborah.
They're up there in that little box right up there. See, there's everybody. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Okay,
Bye, Don.
bye-bye.
Eddie, had to see you
Bye,
there.
bye, Oscar.
Good night.
Marina.
Take care. Bye-bye, darling.
Thank you, Dr. Jan.
Bye, Oscar. Bye, Sally.
See you.